Okay. Instruct. I should have just downloaded this upstairs. I don't know what thing I had it like all plugged in and everything. I should have just. I think it's taking forever. Here we go. Did you put upload a new one?
I did not.
Okay. That makes it easier. Here we go. Oh, right. Yours was like it didn't load right on mine for some reason. Shit. What did I do about that? Do you remember what I did? Did you email it to me?
Yes, I emailed you a link.
Okay.
And you said
it worked then.
I got not full points, but I got like the full amount that I could.
That you could at that time. Okay. Because I'm trying to remember how I accessed it because I remember seeing it. Sorry. I should have prepared for that. Microsoft. Now it's a matter of trying to find it again. You guys get to see my email. Outlook. It's very common. I would have thought it would just be here. It does, doesn't it? So it looks good. It's just loading. It's just taking a little bit. Okay.
Difficult one that.
Yay. But it worked. I like Canva. Like I like the features it has.
Yeah,
It's
that's
just hard for
why
me to
I used
access it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Okay. I did salmonellosis, also known as salmonella. Salmonella originates in the intestinal tracts of human and animals. You contract salmonella by eating foods contaminated with animal feces, and bacteria is shed through your feces. A fun fact is salmonella can actually be shed through your poop for months to a year, even after being treated. Very weird, but it's cool. Transmission. So how it's transmitted, salmonellosis can be transmitted in several different ways, one of which consists of actually eating raw meat or poultry. Another would be like swimming in the same pool with someone that has had it. That's why when they tell you, I don't know if you've ever heard, but if you've had like diarrhea, you're not supposed to swim in the same pool as like in a public pool. I was a lifeguard, so that's probably the only reason why I know this. Signs and symptoms, the most common are probably the nausea and vomiting, but you can have diarrhea, headache, fever, and chills. Symptoms of the virus can appear anywhere within 6 hours to 6 days after exposure, and they can last 4 to 7 days. Most people recover without treatment, although for some people, this virus can be life-threatening. Now, this genus of bacteria is Bacillus. It's a rod-shaped bacteria, and it's caused by a bacterium called Enterobacteriaceae. I probably botched that, but
better most people do.
it's a gram-negative bacteria, which means it stains pink. It's motile, unicellular. Yes. risk factors. Anyone can get salmonella, but some people are at a greater risk for it. So children, those with autoimmune diseases, are more likely to contract it. Those getting chemo or radiation for cancer, and the elderly. Virulence factors. Salmonella has many virulence factors, including typhoid toxin. This toxin is a part of the bacterial AB toxin family, which consists of an enzymatic subunit and a receptor binding subunit. They have flagella, so they can spread throughout the host, and then they have fimbriae, helps them adhere, and then it resists removal from the host. Diagnostic methods, so there's a couple that we can use. You can use blood tests. The vital agglutination test is a test in which Salmonella typhi and paratyphi antigen is reacted with serum, like your blood, to measure agglutinating antibodies to the flagella and lipopolysaccharide antigens. Lots of big words. You can use PCR, can quickly identify salmonella from stool samples, and PCR is actually a good tool that's used in poultry companies. We use ELISA. It's designed to detect the typhi protein antigen. Some of the history about salmonella, I like the little pig. It's really cute. But one of the deadliest salmonella outbreaks occurred in 1985 when approximately 6,000 cases from Salmonella typhimurium were reported among people who had consumed 2% pasteurized milk in northern Illinois. The bacteria Salmonella was first isolated from a pig intestine in 1884 by an American bacteriologist, D.E. Salmon. Carl Joseph Elber discovered the bacillus in the abdominal lymph nodes in the spleen in 1879. Other bacteriologists confirmed his discovery, including Robert Koch, which we learned about. Treatments. Most people recover without needing antibiotics because salmonella is so common. But in severe cases, they might use drugs such as ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin. These antibiotics kill the bacteria while also preventing the growth of it. Oh, and that's all. Does anyone have any questions about? Probably not, but yep. Thank you guys.
And pretty. Yes, your cartoon germs are the cutest. I did each one. What? No, you're lying. You made that? Are you serious? No. Oh, what? But you found each one separate? Oh my God.
Cute. All right. Yes. Thanks. Yeah, no, it goes by. Now I'm just trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. Here we go. This is it.
Someday I'm gonna get you guys to be like 30 plus, and then this will be like no big. Not here anymore. No.
All right. We're talking about GI diseases today. And most of us know how the GI system works. It's going to be your mouth, and then your pharynx is still a part of this as well as part of your respiratory system. Leading this time into your esophagus instead of into, the trachea and everything like that. But esophagus into the stomach, small intestine, then large intestine through the rectum and out the anus is how your food will be traveling. We have accessory organs that help with the digestive process. This will include your salivary glands, your liver, your gallbladder, and your pancreas. They're going to help produce enzymes and other things to help break down your food and absorb the nutrients that you need, as well as help filter out toxins along the way. So defenses that we have, of course, we have mucus. This is a huge, huge part of basically your mucosal surface in your whole body is going to be in your GI tract. So part of what having a mucosa is IgA, secretory IgA. So that's special antibody that works better in the mucosa than IgG would. Peristalsis is that smooth muscle movement that's just going to keep everything kind of moving through. That also keeps microbes, bad guys, moving through. Lysozyme, remember that's going to break down our peptidoglycan. Lactoferrin is going to hoard away iron so that the microbes can't get it. They need it for their enzymes too. The low pH of the stomach. The bile is a higher pH, but it's also antimicrobial with how it functions. And then we have the gut-associated lymphoid tissue where all of our white blood cells are going to be to help prevent infection as well. Probably the biggest thing that we have going for us in our gut is our microbiome. Your oral microbiome has a part to play as well. So this is mostly bacteria. We do have methane producing archaea that can be part of your microbiome as well. You can also have fungi. Mostly we're talking about yeast here, right? And then some protozoa. Interestingly, stomach and up tends to be our gram positives. And then everything past the stomach in your actual GI, like in your actual colon and stuff, tends to be your enteric gram negatives. So it's pretty interesting, I guess. I don't know, it's a fact. I think they don't do as well in like the bile salts and that stuff, but they are a little hardier for like what they see in the upper part of it. So like we said, most common types are going to be your firmicutes. Firmicutes are your gram positives, right? Because they're firm, because that thick cell wall. Believe it or not, you're going to see that crap on the test. Yes, it's going to be there, man. I've already verified it. I finished the test. It's totally written now. So you guys should be good with that. Like I said, just while we're talking about it, and you guys are going to get a notification tomorrow, but the test, only things you're going to see on the test are stuff that are on your study sheets. So I will not ask questions outside of the study sheets. I know there are other sources that we have that like for reviews or in the slides that I present from might have more information outside of that. That's for you to help you understand what's on the study sheet. But again, I will only test you over what's on the study sheets, FYI. Okay. So anyways, moving on. For every gram of crap, literally, that you have in your intestines, for every little tiny gram, there are 10 to the 11th, so it's one with 11 zeros after it, microbes per gram. That is pretty impressive. So a lot of microbes in there. Most of those guys are going to be gram negative, but they can be of any various type of thing. They're bacteria, they're fungi, there's protozoa that can be involved in there. And your accessory organs like your liver and your gallbladder and stuff should essentially be free of biota, but your direct path, your colon especially, should be pretty heavily populated. Remember that these guys are protective. They're providing that sort of microbial antagonism. They're taking up the stadium seats. They're eating the nutrients in the area, and they're creating antimicrobial peptides as well. So they're protective with microbial antagonism, but they're also breaking down your foods to nutrients that you can use. They're also training your immune system as to what is friendly and not friendly. And a lot of their byproducts and the way they interact with your body also helps with a great deal of how the rest of your body functions, not just your GI system. So we're talking about mental health and cardiac health and all sorts of stuff that could be affected by your gut microbiome. First of all, into our diseases. The most common infectious disease amongst all human beings, to make Emily happy, this is dental caries. We're finally in the dental stuff. So dental caries, hands down, the most common infectious disease. Now, it's not necessarily communicable. You can exchange, of course, microbes from person to person, but essentially a lot of what is going to be causing tooth decay, which is what dental caries is going to be just your own microbiome. And introducing sugars or other foods that get stuck in crevices or in little, we'll call them, they call them pellicles. That's the appropriate term for it. But any rough surface on your tooth where the bacteria can attach to or get stuck in, they'll start creating a biofilm. And on that biofilm, they'll start to ferment sugars and things like that and make acid as byproducts. The acid byproducts eat through enamel and down into dentin and even down into the roots and pulp and everything down in there, which can get pretty nasty if it is left untreated. Most of the time, a lot of this is going to be driven by Streptococcus mutans and Streptococcus sobrinus. Very common guys in your oral, microbiome. You're going to have dental caries and tooth decay regardless of if you have cavities or not. So we're not necessarily talking about cavities themselves, but anytime that there's bacteria growing in your mouth, they can be causing some form, even a microscopic amount of decay going on there. So this is always going to be happening in almost every single person alive. Best way to control this, keep it from going out of control, is brushing regularly, especially after you eat. at least twice a day. You don't want to brush too hard because you don't want to damage your enamel from the brushing either. And then you also want to floss to get in between the teeth because brushing doesn't get between your teeth. I don't know why that's not obvious to people, but it is not going to help between your teeth. So you want to get out all the plaque and the biofilm, which the biofilms that these guys form is plaque. You want to get that stuff out by flossing in between the teeth and removing those biofilms that would be building up, preventing them from getting that all out of place. The mouthwash is a great way to kind of get rid of any of the residual stuff if you're keeping up with that pretty regularly, along with your dental cleanings to help clean out anything that you're not getting with your brushing and flossing. You should be fine. Having said that, most people don't adhere to at least one of those things. So keep that in mind. So dental caries are extremely common. The effects of it are going to be less severe the better you take care of your teeth, but it's all going to be thanks to biofilm formation. So here's some images of removal of plaque that has formed on teeth, that biofilm that has built up from these bacteria building up on one another. And again, it's not just going to be one species, but it can be predominated by like Streptococcus, mutans, and Sobrinus, and those usually resulting in the decay process. Okay, so we've got dental caries going on, we've got our biofilm formation, and now you would be developing into gingivitis and periodontitis. Gingivitis, literally, itis being inflammation, gingiva, the gums. So your gum tissue sees those guys that are building up in that plaque on your teeth, that biofilm, they see that as being foreign. Those PAMPs that they recognize, they see that and start forming the inflammatory response. You get the bacteria not just on the surface of your teeth, but up underneath the gum, in the little pockets as well. And as you have inflammation going on, you have recession of the gum tissue. You also have the pockets underneath the gum tissue continuing to house, and protect those bacteria that aren't getting brushed away. And so the inflammation, it just gets worse and worse and worse unless you are brushing and flossing to help, remediate that. If you are flossing regularly, you usually don't have any issues with gingivitis. But if you start to floss just out of the blue and you haven't been in a while, then you can have bleeding and pain associated with your flossing. And that is what gingivitis is. You can get rid of that pretty easily if you go back to flossing regularly, though. And so it doesn't take very long for your gums to kind of bounce back from that. Once you start having recession of the gum line, it's pretty hard for your gums to recover from that. And once we start having inflammation and recession of your gum line, we have inflammation and recession of the bone as well in response to the spread of this infection into these areas. So this can lead to tooth loss, and that's permanent. You won't get your bone back once that starts to recede, unfortunately. So this can become very permanent damage if you are not keeping up with tooth cleaning and maintenance like we should be. And you can see as you're building up plaque, that will calcify, and that's what is really hard for you to remove. Even brushing isn't really going to help too much with removing that. You're going to need to have a dental cleaning in order to properly remove it once it calcifies. And that's really what causes our irritation to deepen as that goes further down, creates recession of the gum and the bone. Now that can spread even deeper, and it's just as a progressive cycle if you aren't keeping up with that. You're more at risk for periodontitis, which is when we start having that bone involvement in there. You're more at risk for gingivitis and periodontitis if you have the presence of Methanobrevibacter oralis. And that guy, M. oralis, is an archaea, and it's not bacteria. So these archaea, so this is the first archaea that we've really talked about the whole time, but it is related to your higher risk for periodontitis. Now, it's not the only thing. Of course, whether or not you're brushing and flossing, your specific genetic influences, tooth position, effects of what sorts of foods you eat and all sorts of things like this can lead to the development of tooth decay. So just more images reminding you guys, maybe brush and floss. If you don't feel like you need to brush your teeth right now, man, must be a psychopath. Because I look at these images every time I teach this chapter and I get to these pictures and I get to talking about this, I'm like, whew, I need to brush my teeth right now. All right, next is necrotizing ulcerative gingivitis and periodontitis. These guys, originally named because it's called trench mouth, and originally called that because in World War I, they weren't brushing their teeth and they're all around one another and they're, essentially getting exposed to these different bacteria they wouldn't otherwise see. Treponema, Prevotella, and Fusobacterium species are associated with this. They can be part of your normal biota, and of course you can get exposed to them from other people. But if you have these guys and you get gingivitis and periodontitis, it is considerably worse. We have true necrosis and ulcerative decay of the gingiva and the bone. It is significantly worse presentation of these diseases, and it can be considerably more difficult to manage as well once it starts to get out of control. You can even have pseudomembrane formation, just a much, much worse presentation of it. All right, moving on, mumps. This is a viral disease, and it is usually associated with swelling near the jaw, so gopher-like swelling of the salivary glands. That's why it's in the GI area. So you'll just feel sick at first, and then you'll eventually have that swelling, gopher-like swelling of usually just one side of the face, but it can invade other organs as well. This is where we see it presented visually for the mumps. Additionally, 20 to 30% of men that do get mumps can have it localized to the testes and epididymis. This can be transmitted this way, though it doesn't seem to cause any pathogenesis in these areas or any sterility or anything like that. This is exactly the same sort of thing you see with Ebola, actually. So Ebola can localize to the testes as well, and you can recover from Ebola and then still house Ebola in the testes and transmit it that way. Imagine that. I don't know about how to feel about that. All right, moving on to gastritis. Gastritis, so itis and gastro, this is talking about your stomach, okay? So inflammation of the stomach lining, and it's caused usually by Helicobacter pylori. When you have people that have ulcers, we often think about them having like too much acid in the stomach, but it's actually usually caused by Helicobacter pylori. And most people actually have this part of their biome in their stomachs. I'd say most, it's the majority, close to the majority. Anyways, about 50%, maybe a little more than 50%. So start getting ulcers, they'll test for the presence of this bacteria. And it's pretty interesting how they test for it. Goes kind of back to what we learned about urease. So we didn't get to do the urease test, but it was on the lab exam, FYI. It was the question where we had asked some other thing had phenol red as a pH indicator. What other thing in this list also had phenol red? And the answer was the urea test. That was the only question I had on there for urea. But anyways, so in the urea test in the lab, we were looking for ammonia, right? So that was our byproduct from breaking down urea. It also is broken down into ammonia and carbon dioxide. And so if you have Helicobacter pylori, that bacteria makes urease. And what you can do is your patient has a sore belly, they're starting to have acid reflux, they're having issues with ulcers, send them to get a breath test. And what they do is they go to the DLO or wherever, exhale into a bag. And I shit you not, it's like a bag that holds about as much air, maybe the half size of this. And you exhale into this bag and screw a little cap on, and then you drink a drink and it has urea in it. And then you sit there for like 30 minutes to an hour, and then you exhale into a different bag, and then you mail those off, and then they check for carbon-13. And so it's radioactive carbon, and it's going to be present in the carbon dioxide because it's radioactive urea broken down into carbon dioxide that you will exhale as radio-labeled carbon dioxide into that next bag. Crazy. So I actually had that test done, and so I know about that, and worked at DLO too. You had to do the testing for it, but yeah, the breath test. It's a lot of people don't know how it works, but that's how it works. So that guy has urease, and it's basically saying like, hey, you have urease, you probably have this guy living in your stomach. So pretty cool. It's treatable with antibiotics. All right, let's talk about diarrhea. It's pretty much what the rest of this chapter is. There's two kinds of diarrhea we'll talk about, which is the acute diarrhea and the chronic diarrhea. We'll start off with acute. So any diarrhea is defined as 3 or more loose stools in a 24-hour period. If that extends beyond 24 hours, past 2 weeks, if you have it 2 weeks or longer, then it gets into chronic. But anything less than 2 weeks, we're talking about acute. So at least a 24-hour period, super, super common, usually especially with contaminated food. And how does the food get contaminated? From poop. So we're talking fecal oral transmission here. There's a lot of different things that can cause it. The most common ones are going to be the viruses. That's not surprising. It's true with a lot of these diseases, right? So the two most common viruses are going to be rotavirus and norovirus, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. And then we have our bacterial causes after that. And then some of these guys can even lead to death, and it's usually going to be due to dehydration that will cause death. We already talked about salmonella, so I'm really not going to get into it too much here, other than to remind you guys that we often are going to diagnose our diarrhea or acute diarrhea agents by their HK and O antigens. So whether they have flagella, capsules, and LPS essentially on their surfaces. And then we can have salmonellosis or typhoid fever, depending on the strain of salmonella that you have. So typhoid fever is a little bit worse presentation. It's what they talk about with Typhoid Mary and how she wasn't, washing her hands handling food, and she just harbored the bacteria just in her gallbladder naturally. Like we were saying, you can pass the bacteria for like decades after being exposed. It just hides out in your GI system and can be spread from then on. So you can act as a carrier that's asymptomatic. So salmonella, typically we're talking about diarrhea, maybe some nausea associated with that and vomiting, but gastroenteritis sort of stuff. But with Shigella, we're moving into the next level. So Shigella dysenteriae, believe it or not, by its name, causes dysentery. Dysentery is just a term referring to bloody diarrhea. So once that diarrhea becomes bloody, it's called dysentery. It's not a specific kind of disease that you get on the Oregon Trail. It's any bloody diarrhea, okay? So you don't want to have bloody diarrhea. And Shigella dysentery just happens to be named for the fact that it causes bloody diarrhea. Now, Shigella, they're also gram-negative. They're also rods, but these guys are non-modal. We learned about how Salmonella was modal, had the flagella and everything. These guys are non-modal. They're defined by the fact that they have toxins that they produce, the enterotoxin and the Shiga toxin. The enterotoxin and the Shiga toxin work together to cause damage to the GI, basically the insides of your intestines, and leads to pretty significant damage. Again, causing bleeding. So yeah, it would have to be significant. And specifically the Shiga toxin, we're going to remember this one, okay? So that's one of the toxins that will cause serious damage of the intestinal lining. We can see here looking at the normal colonoscopy versus the inside of a colon of somebody that has shigellosis. So that leading to the damage of that lining, the depletion of the villi that are going to be a part of absorbing your nutrients and everything like that. True bloody diarrhea from damage of that lining. So Shiga toxin is what causes that in shigellosis. It's also Shiga toxin that causes it with E. coli 0157H7. We call E. coli 0157H7 STEC, or Shiga toxin producing E. coli. So it makes the same toxin. So guess what? It causes dysentery. We already know not all E. colis are made equal. There's the E. coli that are normal in your colon, the E. coli that can cause your urinary tract infections, and then the E. coli that they call recalls for food for, and that's this one, STEC. So basically what you need to know about it is that we also have the hemolytic uremic syndrome for this, can cause kidney damage and failure associated with this. So produces the toxins and has just like, LPS, and your body's just overreacting to it. And that would lead to that hemolytic uremic syndrome. This is your whole body kind of reacting to it, can lead to kidney damage and everything like that from the inflammation response to it. There's a lot of different kinds of E. coli out there. I used to have you guys have to know all of them, but now the basic ones that you know are just normal E. coli that's in your gut. It doesn't get its a special name, okay? Just regular old E. coli. STEC, that has the Shiga toxin, acute diarrhea. Enteroaggregative, which is the second from the bottom. This is associated with kids and people with AIDS, but that's chronic E. coli diarrhea. Then we have diffusely adherent, or D8 E. coli, EC, that leads to urinary tract infections. So it makes sense. It's a little more adherent. So it literally adheres to the walls of the urinary tract and doesn't get flushed out like most bacteria would. It's just more adherent and just more resistant to being flushed out. All right, moving on, we have Campylobacter. This is a bacteria that's a gram-negative bacteria, super, super common. They don't even really test for this for food safety concerns because it's just so common. Leads to, diarrhea and vomiting and just GI stuff. No dysentery here for this one, though, just GI, just normal kind of diarrhea stuff. What I would say about it, it can also be transmitted by pets. They can carry it in their own stool and can, in very, very rare cases, cause Guillain-Barré as a side effect. Moving on to Clostridioides, or Clostridium difficile, they changed the name of it to Clostridioides. Still gram-positive, still endospore forming, causes pseudomembranous colitis. So it creates a membrane across the colon so that things can't really pass through it the way that they're supposed to. It also has toxins that will cause necrosis of the colon and often works in tandem to either worsen or even cause diverticulitis. So pockets of pus developing from this damaged colon tissue. not allowing for proper digestion, and then things get caught in the pockets and it just causes worse infection. So C. diff, really bad thing to have. You can treat this with broad spectrum antibiotics as well as metronidazole to prevent, what am I trying to say? Anaerobic. Metronidazole treats anaerobic bacteria. You can also want to clear out all the flora that you can and just replace it with new from the fecal transplant that we've talked about in the past. But you can see on the left side, that's actually a healthy colon. And then on the right, this is that pseudomembrane that will form from the pseudomembranous colitis. All right, moving on to cholera. This is Vibrio, which means comma-shaped. So these are comma-shaped guys, a little bit of curve to these rods. They do have one single flagellum. They are motile. Excuse me, cholera causes something called rice water stools. You also have vomiting associated with this. The rice water stools are exactly what it sounds like. If I boiled up some rice and took the water out and showed it to you, you would not be able to tell it from cholera patient's stool, quote unquote. I mean, obviously, initially you'll be clearing out poop, but like once eventually you get later into the disease, you're going to have rice water stool. Now you're just evacuating water from your cells as well as your electrolytes from your cells and can very, very quickly become dehydrating to dangerous levels. It's a 55 to 70% mortality rate if you are not pushing fluids. You want to push fluids orally because that's the best way to rehydrate the areas that are being affected, whereas IV fluids will help with it being deadly, but you really want to, ideally you want to give both ways, but the best way, if you have to choose one or the other, is going to be the oral fluids. Best way to treat diarrhea in general, by the way, of course, is pushing fluids and electrolytes. So even treating with antibiotics for a lot of these cases isn't really going to help a ton unless you're in a really bad state. So this won't help with antibiotics too much because the antibiotics are just going to get flushed out. The area where you need the antibiotics to get to is already pushing out so much fluid, you're not going to get antibiotics to the area. So you wait this out. That's what you do with cholera. This is one of those, what was I saying? Oregon Trail, thank you. This is one of those Oregon Trail diseases that you will be pretty hard to not die from. You want to stay very well hydrated with it. So this is usually caused by the cholera toxin. This is what actually causes your cells to exude all the fluids and electrolytes that they have. You need your electrolytes in order to cause nerves impulses to be able to be transmitted. Without them, you'll start having cramps really quickly in your muscles, and then eventually you'll have seizures and coma and death resulting from dehydration. It's usually what's going to happen. This is fecal oral transmission, and oftentimes we see this in like disaster areas where we don't have proper control of water supply, cleanliness. You can also have different kinds of Vibrio that aren't cholera based. You can have similar symptoms develop. These are usually associated with like seafood. Like oysters is the big one. They used to like be a big deal with oysters off the coast of New York back in like the 1800s or whatever. And they realized that the sewage that they were dumping into the ocean, when certain currents would go certain ways, it would contaminate the oysters. And so there's certain times of year that they couldn't have oysters because they would be contaminated with fecal. Isn't that nice? Next, we have Cryptosporidium. Cryptosporidium is a protozoa. So everything up till now has been bacteria. Cryptosporidium is a protozoa. It forms cysts that are very highly resistant to chlorine. Again, another reason why they don't want you going to swim whenever you have diarrhea, because as I'm sure Emily would tell you, is that as a lifeguard, you do realize that public water is poopy water, basically, is pretty much how that goes, is poopy. So it is there. And so these guys, the cysts are very resistant to chlorine. And so you don't want this to get contaminated into swimming pools because you'll have to pretty much disinfect the pool. There's really no other way to get rid of it. You can't just add enough chlorine or whatever to treat it. So this can get pretty bad and is pretty transmissible. Again, protozoa, cysts. What is the part that would actually be making you sick that you took home though? That's the trophozoite, right? Because it has to breed and create the infection. In order to do that, you are not dormant. That's what cysts are, dormant. Next is the rotavirus. We kind of already said this one. This one's probably the most common cause of diarrhea. It is fecal oral transmission. This one doesn't have to be associated with food as much. It's just super transmissible. And there is a vaccine available for it for little babies that might be at risk. Norovirus is another one that's very, very common everywhere we go, but it is the most common one that's going to cause illness issues on cruise ships. So you can have it outside of cruise ships, but if you have diarrhea-related illnesses on cruise ships, usually norovirus is the culprit. So it is associated with cruise ships. I almost always ask that on the exam, just FYI. Why cruise ships? I think it's just because things like rotavirus and stuff, they are going to be rampant in the population in general, but with norovirus, because you have people in like closed small areas and people not washing their hands and sharing from like buffets and just all that stuff, I think it is a little hardier. So it just does better in that sort of like closed environment. Gross, right? All right. Yeah. Food poisoning. Now, this is a different thing. These are going to get you sick within an hour to 6 hours of eating, maybe less, maybe up to 24, depending on the thing that's causing it. But it's usually within 1 to 6 hours, and it's self-limiting, so it's also going to be done within about 24 hours. It's the poison, it's the toxin that these things produce that's making you sick, and we call it intoxication because of that. So you're not actually getting infected with the bacteria. It's the toxins that they produce. It's sort of like when we talk about botulism, right? So you can food with botulism, you're not getting infected really with the bacteria, but that botulism toxin is what's making you sick. So it's sort of like that. Ones that we haven't talked about, because remember with botulism, what symptoms are you going to have? Flaccid paralysis. That's not GI symptoms. These guys are going to cause GI symptoms. Staph aureus is easily the most common one. You can carry it, 4% of the population has it naturally as part of their flora. It's also everywhere in like the environment and stuff. So grandma makes you, potato salad, and it's out at the family Thanksgiving or at the family picnic or whatever, and it sits out. The bacteria can grow on that, and they're fine. And you wouldn't get infected by the bacteria by eating it because it doesn't really do well through the GI tract. But the toxins that it produces will cause you to have GI symptoms. And so within 1 to 6 hours, you start feeling sick from eating something, but then you're over it within 24 hours. It's usually staph that's going to be making those toxins, usually. Now, there's other ones as well, Bacillus cereus and Clostridium perfringens. These guys are endospore forming, and the endospores aren't really as much of the issue. They can survive in, like, under heat lamps and all sorts of stuff like that, but the toxins that they're active, remember, their vegetative forms can make, are what's going to make you sick here. C. perfringens is a little bit different because if it gets deep enough into the GI tract, it will be able to survive that and create another actual proper infection. But if you're just getting sick from the toxins, that's intoxication, right? You guys remember C. perfringens from before? We talked about this guy before, gas gangrene. So we can get this from deep wounds too, but it presents differently. When it does get in your GI system like that, it's pretty similar to C. diff. All right, moving on to the chronic diarrhea. So anything that lasts longer than 2 weeks, you're still having those loose stools about 3 times a day, can be caused by having IBS or ulcerative colitis. These are not infectious reasons. But it's not only, I'm just reminding you guys, not only infectious things that cause these things. For our infectious stuff, we already mentioned the aggregative E. coli. I have to say it slow like that or else I can't say it. We already talked about this one. And so they're going to adhere to cells, human cells, and aggregate around them instead of just being like loose, free cells or whatever. So this aggregation of these cells is what is characteristic of this. It is transmissible through food and water, and it causes chronic E. coli, usually in kids and people with AIDS. So it's not as serious as the S-Tech one. Next, we have Cyclospora. Oh, Cayetanensis. I don't say that a lot because I usually do honestly just call this Cyclospora is usually what it's called. This is a protozoa, and this will lead to it's fecal oral transmission, and you'll have diarrhea. Diarrhea protozoa. Next, we have Giardia. Giardia has had many names over the decades. Giardia duodenalis, Giardia intestinalis, and Giardia lamblia. They're all the same thing. It doesn't really matter. So Giardia, giardiasis. This is a flagellated protozoa, and it leads to diarrhea, a very long, months-long diarrhea with abdominal pain, a lot of flatulence, and greasy malodorous stools that are associated with this diarrhea. Again, for months. It's usually water that is contaminated from animal feces. So it's usually carried by mammals like beavers and coyotes and things like that. People can also harbor them within their normal biota. So that can be a danger as well. So you do want to boil your water before you drink it if it comes from a non-treated source. Next, we have Entamoeba histolytica. This is an amoeba. So our Giardia had a flagella. Amoebas move by pseudopods, right? So there's the globbing around fake feet thing. This guy is a little worse. It's going to be, again, chronic diarrhea, but this guy can cause dysentery. So it could be a lot more severe and can transmit into other tissues of the body as well. So we call this amoebiasis. And so you can have intestinal and extra-intestinal. So that means outside of the intestine. So it can move outside. Again, worse. Moving on to hepatitis, itis of the liver, right? Hepatitis. This can include necrosis of hepatocytes. We have actual death of the cells. We have white cells that will cause inflammation within the liver. And then the damage that's caused by the inflammation can lead to disruption of bilirubin coming out of bile production. And then that'll be seen in the skin as jaundice, so that yellow color. Hepatitis A. So hepatitis in and of itself is a syndrome, right? It can be caused by a lot of different things, and not all of it is infectious. So our infectious versions, we'll start with hepatitis A. This is going to cause flu-like symptoms. It only rarely causes jaundice. We don't even have chronic presentation of liver disease. This is something that you usually get over on your own. There are immunizations available for Hep A, and it is transmitted by the fecal oral route. I know everybody always thinks that all hepatitis is like this horrible blood and sex-related stuff, but it's not. Hep A is fecal oral transmission, and you'll just usually get over it. But there is vaccination available, so you don't have to risk it. Hep B, however, is a DNA virus that actually uses reverse transcriptase. Even though it's DNA, we all remember DNA goes to RNA, that's your messenger, right? And then to protein after that through translation. Well, it does its DNA to RNA and then uses reverse transcriptase to turn the RNA back into DNA, and then inserts that into your genome. And that's how you can get cancer from hepatitis. It's very well known for that, actually. You'll have feeling sick, then you'll eventually get some rashes and arthritis, and then your hepatocellular carcinoma can develop later on down the line. Once you have hepatitis B, you have it forever. However, there are vaccines available for hepatitis B, so you do want to be sure that if you're going into the healthcare industry or are at risk for sticks, things like anything dealing with blood and dental, because you're dealing with sharp instruments, they want to be sure that you get vaccinated for that as well. So this is any little tiny amounts of blood can transmit this. This can be transmitted sexually because of that, because microabrasions that occur. So if you are at risk for getting HIV, you're at risk for getting Hep B. Hep C is different. It has similar presentation to Hep B, but once you get infected with Hep C, a good proportion of people can remain infected indefinitely and not clear this out. There are treatments available for this if you are catching it earlier on in infection during the acute phase, and you can cure this 100% with those medications. However, there are no vaccines for hepatitis C, and once it gets into that chronic phase and you start having the cancer involved with this one, then it's harder to get rid of. Now, Hep C is transmitted by blood transfusions and needle sharing, so this is a little bit more heavy involvement in transmission with the blood. Let's talk about the helminths. I know you guys are going with allergies just as much as I am. I just can't, my throat. All right. Helminths are animals. They are parasitic worms, and we often consider these neglected tropical infections, but some of these we actually have here in the United States. So they're not very well funded because most of these are going to be problems in third world countries, and where are they going to get the money from to study that? So virulence factors depends on the organism, and a lot of these guys being multicellular, they have specific mouth parts for attachment to different parts of the body. They have enzymes that they make to liquefy and penetrate tissues. Our definitive host with these infections are usually the organism where you have actual reproduction going on. So you're making the eggs. This is called our definitive host. You diagnose this by presentation of eosinophilia. So that means a lot of eosinophils. Eosinophils being granulocytes, right? Part of our innate immune response. And these guys are usually associated with parasitic infections or allergies. Typically, naturally speaking, we're talking about parasitic infections. So then they suspect that based on your blood work, they might look at your stool or other tissues of the body to look for eggs and larvae and adult worms. There's no vaccines for any of these. You treat these with the typical anti-helminthic drugs like praziquantel or ivermectin. You want to be sure you're disposing of sewage properly, treating water properly, never use human feces for fertilizer, wash any foods and vegetables that you may be eating because it could have been exposed to human feces or somebody handling it that didn't wash their hands that had one of these. And be sure you're freezing your food because worms don't do well with being frozen and thawed. Whole organisms that need to be having their whole systems working together. So let's get into our parasitic worms. First one is Enterobius vermicularis. Have you ever heard of vermicelli? Vermicelli is a type of very thin spaghetti, and that's what these guys are named after. Pinworms, yeah. Pinworms are, I know. I used to think I liked vermicelli until I learned the name of this organism, and now that's all I can think of. But yes, Enterobius vermicularis pinworms. So we know this one. This is when little kids look at itchy little buttholes. You put the tape on it and take the tape off. If there's worms they're wriggling on the tape, then you have this. You can get your treatments over the counter. It's typically, I think, ivermectin. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like those of us who may not have had kids or dirty kids might not know. I didn't have this, but I know people that have as kids, and it's here in the United States. It's really not that uncommon. Like I said, you can just get treatment over the counter. Your doctor even won't really treat it. They'll be like, go to Walmart and get the treatment. And typically, if one person in the family has it, they'll treat everybody in the family because people can be asymptomatic too. Next, we have trichuria. This is the whipworm. The only animals that are infected by this one is people. This is related to fecal transmission, but it's not fecal oral for this one. Poor sanitation, you're walking shoeless in areas that are contaminated with contaminated feces, water contaminated with feces, and these guys can get in through intact skin of your feet and things like that. So they'll burrow in through the skin, get in that way, and then you poop out the eggs, essentially. Can cause pretty serious GI effects. Now we're going to talk about some tapeworms. There's a couple of tapeworms here, and then the big one that we're familiar with is at the end. Not the end, but in a little bit. Diphyllobothrium latum. This is a tapeworm that we see in sushi typically. So it's pretty common. One that we will see here in America as far as just regular fish transmission of a tapeworm. There's smaller tapeworms. I want to be clear about this. We're going to talk about the big one later. Hymenolepsis species of tapeworms. These guys, we don't see these in America as much, but these are the more common tapeworms across the rest of the world. Hymenolepsis. Moving on to Ascaris lumbricoides. This is actually the most common helminthic infection in the entire world. This is the giant intestinal roundworm. So nematoda, right? These guys live in your intestine. They are large like this, and they can ball up and cause all sorts of bowel obstructions and things. The larvae will move into the circulatory system and move into the respiratory tree, where you will cough them up as they get bigger and then swallow them again. And it continues their life cycle like that. So you can see images of kids that are living in these sub-Saharan Africa, third world countries, coughing up visible worms, and they'll be coming out of their nose and things like that. Horrifying to think of, but this happens to people. Again, this is the most common of all the helminthic infections in the world, and this is what people are actually dealing with. And makes you think, when you don't really hear about stuff like this, how much we're ignoring the rest of the world. All right, moving on to Taenia solium. This is the typical tapeworm that we're used to thinking of with the segments. It's all 6 meters long or whatever, 5 meters, I guess, long. These guys, those little segments that break off are called proglottids, and they're filled with eggs. So those guys will break off and be excreted in the feces, and then can be passed on to other animals. If you were to ingest one of those proglottids and get infected that way, typically you can develop cysticercosis, and it's usually neurocysticercosis if you're here in America. That means that the larvae will insist in the brain and create these cysts that if you rupture them, you have immediate inflammatory reaction that can be nearly immediately deadly. It's almost impossible to treat these once they move into the brain. So we think a lot of the tapeworm when it's stuck in your gut and eating up all your calories, and I don't want to be fat anymore. Let's eat a proglottid or whatever, and it'll eat up all my calories. And it will do that if it takes up house in your gut. But if it takes up house in your brain, you get worms in your brain. So gross. Don't get tapeworms. If you get infected meat and you ingest the infected meat, then you will get typical tapeworm. Ingest the proglottid, it's more likely to get neurocysticercosis. Don't do it. All right, Opsithorchus sinensis and Clonorchus sinensis. Aren't these great? See, you guys get so worried about saying your one little organism name, and I'm up here with all this crap. These are the Chinese liver flukes. Now, flukes, remember, these are flatworms, and flatworms being platyhelminthes. We have two kinds of flatworms: the cestodes, which are our tapeworms, and then these guys are the trematodes, the flukes. So, you know why I'm bringing that up is because we have the final coming up. You guys know you're going to get asked about that stuff. These guys, flukes, liver flukes, they really don't cause too many symptoms unless they're blocking your bile duct. And that's where they like to hang out, is the bile duct. Once they start having issues there, you can have problems with your liver function and then presentation like you have gallstones, but it's not. It's just you've got worms. So, all right, next is trichinosis. So trichinosis is why we cook our pork fully. You can eat raw beef, you can even eat raw chicken, but you're at risk for salmonella. But if you eat raw pork, you're at risk for trichinosis. These guys, these larvae will insist into the muscle tissue of the pork, and that's how it gets transmitted to you. And then it has this life cycle involving getting in through your gut and then into your muscles and insist in there. And you have pain in your muscles and in your joints that eventually will happen after you've had your full cycle. You feel sick, you start having inflammation all over the body, and then you have these worms that basically embed themselves in your muscle tissue. So cook your pork. I actually think this is why a lot of religions like Judaism have rules for like kosher handling of meats, is because they realize that if they cook their meat or if they handle it certain ways, they're less likely to get sick. And we think that it's trichinosis that spawned that idea. Most of what I say about pretty much everything I wanted to say about it. Next, we have schistosomiasis. This is another liver disease. You can also have schistosomiasis in the bladder. So this is Schistosoma, Masoni, and Japonicum. They are very morphologically different. They look different from one another, but they present with similar disease. These guys invade your intact skin. They have a life cycle step involving snails. So what happens is you are a poopy person or whatever, or you have this and you pee into water and it contaminates the water. The snails in the water get contaminated, and then the larvae or whatever come out of the snails, and then the snails get into your skin and they embed, not snails, I'm so sorry, the worms. I don't know which one's worse, honestly. But the flukes, these are blood flukes. We call them liver flukes and blood flukes because these guys actually live in your bloodstream. Anyways, they embed into your actual skin and get in your intact skin and cause something called swimmer's itch. So if it's in the water that's been contaminated and has snails that have been contaminated by some other people's poop or whatever. So yeah, there's a whole life cycle involved in most of these guys. You are welcome that I don't make you learn these life cycles because they are freaking ridiculous. But anyways, so the larvae get into your skin, cause swimmer's itch, and then they move into the bloodstream and can cause hepatomegaly and splenomegaly, so those organs get enlarged. All sorts of disease. It can cause bladder obstruction, eventually moving into the bladder. That can be quite severe, blood and urine, all sorts of stuff. So you'll have a full-on inflammatory response throughout the body. They actually can coat themselves in the antigens from your own bloodstream to hide from your immune system. So they coat themselves with your proteins to hide. Pretty crazy how they do that. Yeah, it's pretty terrifying but cool, right? Praziquantel is what we use to treat this. So these are all of our GI diseases that we've gone through. Here's our little summary of where they can be found. And it is only 6:38, so you know what that means. We're gonna do the questions. These ones aren't so bad. You don't have to stand. I'm not gonna, but I am gonna call you out. For those of you who are here anyways, right? Again, only 5 questions and they're not so bad this time. So what is the most common infectious disease in all of humans? Haley. I don't know, you came in a little later. I'll ask you another question. I'll ask you another question later, okay? Okay, guess what? It's Emily. Not even kidding. Yes. Yes, it is. I was hoping it would be you that I picked out. That's the like one time I actually taught anything dental at all. Yes, what were we gonna ask?
Like enough to know, or do we need to know the specific?
Dental care. I won't ask you about sobriety. No, I will ask you about those. Yeah. I should, but no, I'm not going to. All right, dysentery. Do you know this one, Haley? Do you know what dysentery is? What is it? Yes, it is. All right. What type of organism is Giardia? Is it a virus, bacteria, protozoa, or helminths? I have Taylor. I have Fidel. What do you think? Yeah, you have 4 guesses. Giardia. So this was the one, I'll give you a little hint. I guess I'll just tell you about it and see if it helps. It had the flagella, I will say that. And this was one that was in water that you had to boil and that animals can house it. Have a guess? Yes, it is protozoa. Good guess. All right. And then we have David isn't here, right? He's not here either. What type of organism causes cysticercosis or neurocystis? Dusty. When it gets in, the one that I was talking about being in your brain, if you ate the proglottids. So what kind of organism would that be? So this would be, you can call it helminths or protozoa or bacteria or whatever, something like that. Yes, it is. So this one was the tapeworm, the typical tapeworm, Taniosolium. And our last question is, how do schistosomes enter your body? Karen's not here. This is somebody who dropped the glass, of course. All right, Christy. So this one is the swimmer's itch one. So I'm still going to give you the points for it because you guessed. So yeah, that's all the questions I have for today. And that's all we have for the lecture today. And guess what? You get to go home this time. There's no lab. Yeah, I know. I know. Brush your teeth and go get a shot of ivermectin. Yes, so we do get bonus points for these. I'm glad you asked. Everybody, because everybody's been really good about participating on the questions, everybody gets full. There's not, I know we had the competition of the groups.
There's only 2 people in my group, so I feel like that's a little, I mean, Emily's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was, that was part of the reason why I decided that I would just go ahead and give everybody full credit for it. I didn't want to. Should I leave my phone upstairs? I guess I do.
Although I would say for the when we have it. That was so good. I was so glad she didn't add. Right. Everyone else had like 4 bags. Too many people just get through it. So I was fine. The kids like my clock. I don't think ours has ever been up. And now when I'm doing it, well, I'm not
I always wonder that.